All right, so we're diving deep today into driving change, right? And we've got some great excerpts from Jonah Berger's Catalyst. It's a book all about, well, the psychology of making change happen.
Okay.
So our mission here is to really, pull out those golden nuggets, those actionable insights on how we can all become more effective catalysts for change in our own lives.
I think what's really cool about how Berger approaches this is he uses all these real world examples to illustrate those kind of psychological barriers to change. And
Right.
it makes it so much more relatable and applicable.
Like, for instance, that story about the FBI hostage negotiator.
Oh, yeah, Greg Vecchi.
Craig Vecchi, right? And his kind of unusual approach to diffusing that tense standoff.
So Vecchi, he understood that people have this deep-seated need for autonomy, right? Like, we want to feel like we're in control.
Okay.
And when that sense of autonomy is threatened, it triggers this psychological phenomenon that Berger calls reactance.
The reactance.
Which is basically just this knee-jerk resistance to being told what to do.
Makes sense.
So instead of, barking orders at the suspect, Vecchi decided to connect with him on a human level.
Human level, okay.
He asked about his family, even his pets.
Interesting.
And by finding that common ground and establishing trust, Vecchi was able to persuade the suspect to surrender peacefully.
It's amazing, isn't it? That showing empathy, even to someone who could be dangerous, could be so effective.
It is. It's really powerful.
And this, out-of-the-box thinking, that's what Berger is encouraging in Catalyst.
Exactly. And this whole concept of reactance, it also pops up in the most unexpected places. Remember the whole Tide Pod challenge?
Oh, right. Laundry detergent becoming a dangerous viral trend.
It's kind of crazy, right?
It is kind of crazy, but it seems like all those warnings from Procter & Gamble about not eating the pods may have actually backfired, made it more appealing to people looking for online fame.
Because by emphasizing what not to do, it might have triggered that rebellious impulse,
It's like the forbidden fruit, isn't it? You tell someone they can't have something, and they suddenly want it even more.
Exactly. And it reminds me of that Truth anti-smoking campaign that was targeted at teenagers.
Oh, right.
Instead of lecturing them about the dangers of smoking, they flipped the script.
Oh, so...
They exposed the tobacco industry's manipulative tactics, right? Showing how they were trying to trick teens into becoming addicted.
So they were basically rebelling against big tobacco by choosing not to smoke.
It was brilliant. They used reactance against itself.
Really smart.
It just highlights how understanding psychology can be so much more powerful than just giving people information.
Absolutely. So we've got reactance, but there's another big psychological barrier that Berger talks about.
Oh, endowment.
Endowment, right.
Which basically explains why we overvalue things we already own, even if they're not that valuable objectively.
Right, like that experiment with the coffee mugs.
Exactly. They gave some participants a mug and then asked them how much they'd sell it for. And those who had the mug wanted way more money for it than those who didn't have one, even though it was the exact same mug.
It shows how quickly we get attached to things, huh?
Yeah, even if it's something as simple as a coffee mug.
So if you're trying to get someone to embrace something new, you've got to really show them that the benefits outweigh the losses.
Yeah, you have to make it clear that what they're gaining is worth more than what they're giving up.
And Berger actually quantifies this, right, with the 2.6x rule.
Yeah, he says the perceived advantages of adopting something new have to be at least 2.6 times greater.
2.6 times greater, okay.
Than the disadvantages of letting go of the old.
So, if you're trying to convince someone to switch to a new software, you need to show them how it'll save them a ton of time or money.
To really make that switch worthwhile.
This whole idea of endowment also kind of explains why people cling to old technology or habits even when they're not working.
It's hard to let go of what's familiar even when it's not serving us anymore.
Makes sense.
Berger actually uses a really interesting analogy to illustrate this. He compares it to a sprained finger versus a broken bone.
A sprained finger.
You're more likely to go to the doctor for a broken bone because it's obvious, right?
Sure.
But a sprained finger, even though it hurts, you might just ignore it.
Right, thinking it'll heal on its own.
But sometimes doing nothing is actually more costly in the long run.
So it's like a metaphor for clinging to those outdated habits or technologies, even when they're holding us back.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got these two big barriers to change, reactance and endowment. What are some of the strategies that Berger suggests for overcoming them?
Well, he offers some really practical tactics. And like I said, he uses those real-world examples to make them really clear.
Love that.
So let's start with tackling reactance, that resistance to being told what to do.
Yeah, how do we persuade people without triggering that automatic pushback?
One really effective method is what Berger calls guided choice.
Got it.
Basically, you present a limited set of options that nudge people towards the desired outcome,
Okay.
but it still gives them that sense of control.
Like that classic parenting trick, right? Do you want broccoli or chicken for dinner?
Exactly. The illusion of choice, it works wonders.
It does. So you're still getting them to eat something healthy,
Mm-hmm.
but they feel like they had a say in it.
Another powerful technique is asking questions instead of making statements.
Questions.
This helps people arrive at their own conclusions, which are always more persuasive than being told what to think.
Berger talks about that test prep instructor, right?
Yes, the one who helps students figure out how much they need to study,
By asking them a bunch of questions.
leading them to the answer without directly telling them.
It's like they discovered for themselves.
And that makes them more likely to actually follow through.
Really interesting.
What's fascinating is how Berger applies this principle to hostage negotiation.
Oh, wow. It's a hostage negotiation.
Think about Greg Vecchi again, the FBI negotiator.
Right.
He uses questions masterfully to build rapport and de-escalate the situation.
How so?
By starting with empathy, by trying to understand the suspect's perspective, he's able to turn a potential adversary into someone he can work with.
So it's about guiding, not commanding.
Exactly. It's about finding that common ground.
There's a real theme emerging here, isn't there?
Definitely. So now let's switch gears and talk about strategies for easing endowment.
All right, so how do we help people let go of what's familiar and embrace something new?
That's a great question, and one that we all face.
Whether it's upgrading our phones or trying a new approach at work.
Absolutely. So we've talked about reactance and endowment, but there's more, right?
Oh, definitely. Berger doesn't stop there.
He identifies distance as another major obstacle to change.
Distance.
He's saying that basically we tend to reject perspectives that are too far removed from our own experience.
That makes sense. It's harder to relate to someone whose beliefs or values are completely different from ours.
Exactly. And to bridge this divide, Berger talks about shrinking the distance.
Shrinking the distance.
It's about starting with areas of agreement and maybe asking for less, at least initially.
Less, okay.
He uses this great analogy of a football field.
I'm intrigued. What's the football field analogy?
So imagine that people's views on a particular issue are spread across a football field, right?
I'm visualizing it.
And at each end zone, you have those with the most extreme viewpoints.
Oh.
They're entrenched in their positions.
So trying to convince someone all the way at the opposite end zone to completely change their mind.
It's going to be really tough, probably even counterproductive.
Right, so it's more effective to focus on the movable middle.
The people who are less ideologically rigid, exactly.
Interesting.
Berger gives this example of a political campaign in Oregon.
Okay.
They were trying to unseat an incumbent senator, and they knew that abortion rights was a key issue for many voters.
So instead of trying to convert those who are strongly opposed to abortion rights,
they focused their efforts on pro-choice voters who were already sympathetic to their candidate's stance.
smart strategy, finding that wedge issue to swing enough voters in the middle.
That's how they won.
Wow, fascinating.
Berger also highlights this technique called deep canvassing.
Deep canvassing, what's that?
It's about going beyond those superficial interactions and really engaging people in thoughtful conversations where they're encouraged to think critically and consider different perspectives.
He talks about a study where canvassers were able to change people's minds about transgender rights.
Just through these really deep personal conversations.
It's amazing how powerful those human connections can be.
Absolutely. Sharing stories, listening to each other, it can break down those barriers.
So it's not just about throwing facts and figures at people.
It's about building understanding.
All right, so we've got distance, but Berger also talks about uncertainty as a barrier to change.
It's this natural human tendency to resist the unknown, especially when there's risk involved.
That makes sense. Nobody likes to feel like they're jumping into the void.
So to overcome this, Berger suggests things like free samples, test drives, those freemium models.
Freemium.
It's about letting people experience the benefits firsthand before they fully commit.
It's like reducing that perceived risk, right?
Exactly. Like, think about online shopping. It was a pretty revolutionary concept at first.
Definitely. People were hesitant.
But companies like Zappos, they offered free shipping and returns.
It took away that risk.
And it changed everything. Millions of people started shopping online.
Amazing how a simple policy can have such a huge impact.
Right. And then there's the whole issue of corroborating evidence.
Okay, corroborating evidence.
Berger argues that when people have strong attitudes about something, especially if they're resistant to change,
It usually takes more than just one person's opinion to sway them.
you need multiple sources of proof, and those sources need to be both similar and diverse.
Similar and diverse.
He uses the example of substance abuse interventions, right? One person telling an addict to get help might not be enough.
Right.
But when they hear it from their family, their friends, maybe even people they admire, it creates this powerful sense of social proof.
That change is both necessary and possible.
And Berger also stresses the importance of concentrating that evidence, like delivering those messages close together for maximum impact.
So it's not just about the quantity of evidence, it's also about the timing and the delivery.
Exactly. Like if you're trying to persuade your boss to adopt a new initiative,
Right.
you present your pace, but then you have other colleagues subtly reinforce those same points in later meetings.
So it's like creating this chorus of voices that's hard to ignore.
Absolutely.
Wow, this is all so insightful.
It's clear that driving change is really a multi-layered process.
It requires understanding those psychological barriers and finding creative ways to overcome them.
So with all this knowledge, how do we actually put it into practice? Like, how do we create real lasting change? Well, Berger gives this really inspiring example of how these principles can be applied even in the most challenging of circumstances.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Have you heard of Seeds of Peace?
The name rings a bell, but I can't quite place it.
It's an organization that brings together Israeli and Palestinian teenagers for a summer camp experience.
Wow, that's bringing together people from opposing sides of a really deep conflict.
Exactly. They share meals, they play sports, they have these really intense conversations.
It seems almost impossible to imagine them finding common ground.
You'd think so, but it's incredibly effective.
Right.
They've created this environment where these teenagers can connect on a human level.
Human level.
And it helps them break down those prejudices and stereotypes that fuel the conflict.
So they're shrinking that distance, right?
Precisely. They're creating opportunities for understanding and dialogue.
And it's having a real impact, not just on the kids themselves, but on their communities as well.
It's a powerful example of how change can happen even in the most unlikely of places.
Berger also uses this really striking analogy to describe the process of change itself. He compares it to the Grand Canyon.
Oh yeah, the Grand Canyon. How so?
I'm curious.
He's saying that real transformation rarely happens overnight. It's more like the gradual, persistent process of water carving rock over millions of years.
So it's about patience and perseverance, recognizing that meaningful change takes time and effort.
Exactly. It's about being that catalyst, consistently chipping away at those obstacles until you see the results.
So instead of expecting instant gratification, we should focus on the long game.
And trust that the process will eventually lead to the desired outcome.
This has been an incredible deep dive, really insightful stuff.
It is. It's fascinating how much psychology is involved in driving change.
It really is. It's not just about willpower or good intentions, right?
Definitely not. It requires strategic thinking, knowing those barriers, and then finding those clever ways to get around them.
And Berger, he gives us this handy framework, the Reduce framework.
Oh, right. Reduce.
So it's all about how effective catalysts reduce a react trace.
Endowment, distance, uncertainty.
Exactly. And he gives all those great real-world examples like the Truth Campaign or Zappos offering free shipping.
It shows how those ideas can actually be put into practice.
And what I really love is that Berger emphasizes that anyone can be a catalyst for change.
You don't need to have some special skills or a ton of resources.
It's about understanding the principles and applying them.
Right. You don't need to be like a CEO or a politician to make a difference.
From all the examples in the book, is there one that really stands out for you as a demonstration of how these principles can be used to create positive change?
There's one that really resonated with me. It was the story about this bank manager, Jacek Nowak.
Jacek Nowak, okay.
He wanted to improve the customer experience at his bank.
Which sounds great.
But he faced a lot of resistance from senior management.
They probably didn't see the value in it, thought it was a waste of resources.
Exactly. They were all about the bottom line.
So how did he convince them?
Instead of just trying to, argue with them or present them with data, he decided to let them experience the benefits firsthand.
Interesting.
So he created these personalized, surprise and delight experiences for the decision makers.
Surprise and delight, okay.
To show them how these small gestures could actually create these really powerful emotional connections with customers.
So he reduced uncertainty by giving them a real, tangible example.
Yeah, he let them see it in action.
And it worked.
It did.
Huh?
They ended up adopting his program, which led to, like, happier customers and happier employees.
That's fantastic. It's a great reminder that sometimes the best way to persuade someone is to show, not tell.
Exactly. Actions speak louder than words, right?
Absolutely. And Berger also reminds us that real lasting change, it's a gradual process.
Like you said, it's like the Grand Canyon, right?
Grand Canyon, yeah.
It wasn't formed overnight. It took millions of years of water eroding that rock.
So it's about being patient, persistent, committed to the journey.
Even when you don't see those results immediately.
Exactly. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
We need to be willing to play the long game.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive into the psychology of change.
We've uncovered those hidden barriers and learned some really practical tools for becoming more effective catalysts.
It's all about understanding those principles, reducing reactance, easing endowment, shrinking distance, mitigating uncertainty, and seeking that corroborating evidence.
It sounds like a lot, but it's really about making those small, consistent efforts over time.
Right, like those drops of water carving the Grand Canyon.
Exactly. And remember, anyone can be a catalyst for change.
Now, before we go, I think it'd be helpful to distill the key takeaways from this deep dive into a 10-point summary for our listeners.
A 10-point summary. Oh, I love that. It'll make it really actionable.
All right, so here we go. Number 1, reactance. People don't like being told what to do.
Right. So instead of giving orders, offer choices and empower them to make their own decisions.
Number 2, endowment. We overvalue what we already have.
To overcome that, highlight the costs of inaction and frame change as regaining something lost.
Number 3, distance. Perspectives that are too different from our own experience are hard to accept.
So start with areas of agreement and ask for less initially. You can build from there.
Number 4, uncertainty. People are afraid of the unknown.
So reduce that fear by letting them experience the benefits firsthand, like with those free samples or trials.
Number 5, corroborating evidence. For those really stubborn beliefs, you need multiple sources of proof.
And those sources should be similar enough to be relatable, but also diverse enough to offer different perspectives.
Number 6, concentrate that evidence. Deliver your messages close together to make a bigger impact.
Repetition and reinforcement are key, especially when you're dealing with deeply ingrained beliefs.
Number 7, identify those barriers before you start trying to make a change.
Take some time to analyze what might be holding people back. Use a tool like a force field analysis to really map it out.
Number 8, active listening. Show empathy and understanding through your body language, your words, and the questions you ask.
Create a safe space for open and honest dialogue.
Number 9, remember that change takes time. It's gradual. It's like water carving the Grand Canyon.
Be patient, be persistent, and celebrate those small wins along the way.
And finally, number 10, anyone can be a catalyst.
You have the power to make a difference, no matter who you are or what your background is.
So there you have it, 10 actionable steps to become a more effective agent of change.
It's a roadmap for creating positive change in your own life and in the world around you.
And as we wrap up this incredible deep dive, here's one final thought to leave you with. If people with the deepest of divides can find common ground and connect,
imagine what we can achieve when we consciously apply these principles to our own lives, our communities, our world.
what change will you catalyze today?